how do we reach our goals to reduce emissions and avoid the worst consequences of climate change?
So until the world is totally off of fossil fuels, 100%, it is actually counterproductive to use any form of energy whatsoever to do carbon removal with these kinds of technologies.
And carbon capture and storage is a myth. It does not work. Y'all, my home is dying. I'm here today because I'm an expert on carbon capture and storage and because I'm an organizer and a campaigner, and I'm also someone who's going to be forced out of my home.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be here today, and thank you to Chip and the organizers for inviting us to speak today at AREDAY. My name is Maya Winkelstein. As Chip mentioned, I'm a partner at the 2030 Fund, and we're a private philanthropic initiative that is focused on shifting the climate trajectory of Louisiana in this decade. I'm joined on the stage today by Jane Patton and on Zoom by Dr. Jonathan Foley. And I'm going to introduce them more fully in a couple of minutes, but before we get there, I wanted to take just a minute to frame today's session. So today we're going to be talking about carbon capture and sequestration, also known as carbon capture and storage, also known as CCS, and we'll use that abbreviation CCS today. And specifically, we're going to dive into the possibilities and perhaps perils of this technology, that difference between theory and reality, idea and practice. For those who aren't familiar, CCS is the idea that instead of letting carbon dioxide that is created by the burning of fossil fuels, whether that's to generate electricity or manufacture plastic or steel or cement, it's the idea that instead of letting that carbon dioxide and those gases go into the atmosphere, that there is a technology that could capture those gases before they are released into the atmosphere. And that this carbon could then be transported via pipeline to a place where it can then be injected underground, where it could be stored or sequestered. So there's three pieces to this technology: capture, transportation, and storage or sequestration. And the idea is that this technology would allow industries to continue to produce while avoiding putting more carbon into the atmosphere. It's a fairly appealing idea. However, as we're about to discuss, there does remain a wide gap between the potential benefits of this conceptual idea and the real-world implementation and construction of CCS technologies today. It's also worth noting that in large part due to the 45Q tax credits that are part of the Infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Act, the financial incentives to pursue the construction of CCS projects have shifted so much in the last 2 years that, as Bloomberg News recently put it, quote, "There are fortunes to be made in the carbon capture gold rush." And this is an important point that we'll come back to. But AREDAY is not a business conference, and we are not assembled here to find ways to maximize profits. Right? We're here today because we want to ask questions about how we can reduce emissions. How do we reach our goals to reduce emissions and avoid the worst consequences of climate change? So that's what we're going to focus on in the next 40 minutes. So can the use of CCS reduce total GHG emissions? What would the large-scale construction of CCS technologies look like? And what are the implications of these new industrial developments? And lastly, what is the opportunity cost in terms of time and money of pursuing CCS versus other carbon reduction strategies?
You can't share his screen yet. We're not there yet.
Oh, we're not there yet. Okay. All right. Varushka or is he a co-host? I think he needs to be a co-host in order to share his screen. Okay, great. I'll be right there, John. Anyway, we need to pay attention to the cost-benefit analysis. So with that, I am going to introduce Jonathan, and I'm going to move over here so I can talk and tech at the same time. All right. I'll introduce John, and if we find the right button, it should only take 1 second, so hopefully you'll get there by the end. Dr. Jonathan Foley is the Executive Director of Project Drawdown, the world's leading resource for science-based climate solutions. He is a world-renowned environmental scientist, sustainability expert, author, and public speaker. His work focuses on understanding our changing planet and finding new solutions to sustain the climate, ecosystems, and natural resources we all depend on.
Great. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Here we go. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you. Sorry for the technical glitch. I'll try to go fast a little bit. Well, thank you for a chance to speak to you today about carbon capture, as Maya was just talking about. And I just wanted to bring a little bit of science to the conversation about how we might think about carbon capture and a few key issues that come up with this kind of technology you hear a lot about. The first thing you're going to hear a lot of, especially by people trying to sell carbon capture, is that we, quote, need it, and scientists say that we do. Well, I'm a scientist, and I'll tell you how much we need and what form it would take, and it may not be quite what you're being told. Here's the basic idea. Here's what we have to do to stop climate change. The red curve is the big problem. That's our emissions. Those are big numbers. We're emitting about 60 billion tons of greenhouse gas pollution in total in the 2020s, and that number has been going up over time. If we were to continue on that dotted line, it would be even bigger and much more of a mess. The number 1, number 2, and number 3 job of stopping climate change is to get that number under control and bring it as close to zero as possible, as quickly, safely, and equitably as we can. That's going to be a Herculean task, but that is the only way we can stop climate change for the most part, is cutting the emissions. That's what we really have to do. So even when we cut emissions dramatically by mid-century, which is what we absolutely must do, it is still a concern that we might not be able to cut all the emissions in every economic sector in every country in time. So that's where the idea of carbon removal, the green line, comes in. And the hope is it would grow from basically zero today, or very small number, to a gigaton scale, maybe 5 or 6 gigatons or something like that by mid-century, sometime 30 years from now, grow from a really tiny number to maybe 5 gigatons or so per year. But the thing that's really important here is that climate change is a cumulative problem. It's not the curve that matters, it's the area under the curve. So cutting emissions this decade prevents this much carbon from going into the atmosphere. That's the biggest chunk of work we have to do, is cut emissions and cut them fast between now and 2030 or so. We keep cutting them the next decade and the next decade after that. Carbon removal, though, the ugly truth about carbon removal is that number is zero today, essentially. It's not even a round-off error. If I took all the industrial carbon capture in the world and multiplied by 1 million, you still wouldn't see it on this graph. So it's inconsequential. It's not even a round-off error. We would have to grow that by at least 10 million-fold to show up on this graph, and then grow it through the next few decades to get to a sizable number by 2050. That's a huge task, considering this is already 100-year-old technology and isn't getting much better. So what we're seeing is emissions cuts are most of the answer stopping climate change. Carbon removal in all of its forms, which I'll tell you a few different ways we could do it, is more like 4%. So yes, we need it, but it's very small. And if we don't do the 96% of the work, this won't matter at all. So it's important, but very secondary to the job of stopping climate change. And we have to do it right so it doesn't prevent us from cutting emissions in the first place. But what form can carbon capture take? Well, it can take a lot of different forms. First, of course, we can plant more trees. We can farm soils differently and absorb carbon biologically on land. That works great, and it is the right size already, and it's basically free. The problem is that carbon may not be permanent. Trees burn down, soils get plowed up. We can't guarantee that carbon could be locked up forever. And so that's a little bit of the worry there, of course. Oceans also naturally take up carbon. Maybe we could do some things to help stimulate more carbon removal in the oceans, but we're working with biology here and ecosystems in ways we don't totally understand. So this is still more into the research side. Then we get into what we're talking about today, using machines, industrial forms of removal, which could be carbon capture and storage in a carbon facility like a power plant, a petroleum refinery, a plastic manufacturer, things like this. Or you could take it outdoors in what's called direct air capture, which is a lot harder because you're now doing it in air that isn't concentrated in CO2. But these are basically using machines to scrub CO2 to the atmosphere and pump it below ground. Well, how big is that technology today? Well, as I told you, emissions into the atmosphere are about 60 billion tons going into the atmosphere. The carbon removal that's actually happening on this planet today in the blue line is forest. And that's under 2 billion tons per year. That's what forests are doing. That little black line at the end is all the industrial methods, and I can blow that up. And you see now it's in the millions of tons range, 1,000 times smaller than the kind of units of our emissions. And most of that is in bioenergy and biochar. And then the last little bit, this little yellow blob down there, you can barely see in the thousands of tons range is CCS and DAC. That's what all the fuss is about. This is in the units of thousands of tons while we're building billions and billions of tons into the atmosphere. In other words, it's pathetically small. It's about 1/10,000,000th the size of our emissions. Put another way, all that technology we're hearing about is removing a few seconds of our annual emissions each year. Just a few seconds, less than the time I've been talking, is all of that's work done. That's it. So this is really small, and this is not new technology. It's been around since the 1920s when the Germans first invented carbon removal kind of separation techniques. It was clean coal in the 80s and 90s, CCS, and now DAC. It's a fan with solvent and a pipe. There's not really a very clear path I can see where this will get cheaper and better and scalable through the kind of technology we're talking about, and it's ridiculously small. It's also ridiculously expensive. Even the most profitable industries in humanity's history can't afford it without taxpayers bailing them out. These things cost thousands of dollars a ton to remove carbon. It's probably the most expensive climate solution there is. And again, even oil and gas companies can't afford to do it without huge tax incentives or tax breaks or outright grants. The other concern you have to think about is how much energy does it take? It takes a lot of electricity and heat to remove CO2 out of the atmosphere, liquefied, and put it below ground. And that energy would have been better off being used somewhere else. If it was fossil fuels, we're burning fossil fuels to remove fossil fuel pollution, that's crazy. But if we use renewable energy or nuclear energy, which a lot of people want to, we could have used that somewhere else in the world to get rid of coal and oil in the first place, avoiding far more carbon than this would ever remove. So until the world is totally off of fossil fuels, 100%, it is actually counterproductive to use any form of energy whatsoever to do carbon removal with these kinds of technologies. It just doesn't make sense. That energy would have been better off not doing just something else, anything else. And then we have the question, does it actually really capture carbon? Well, a lot of them actually don't, because ironically, a lot of the carbon that is captured is pumped underground as a working liquid for enhanced oil recovery to drive more oil and gas back out of the ground, what's called EOR. So if it's used for enhanced oil recovery, it's completely counterproductive of removing carbon from the atmosphere because it's enabling us to burn a lot more anyway. So I'm a physicist, and I don't know how to pencil this out because this thing is too small to matter, too expensive for anybody to afford it compared to anything else we could do, uses too much energy, and actually doesn't really store a lot of carbon the way it's used today. So it's basically worthless. The problem is it's actually worse than that. It's worse than worthless because of what you'll hear about called the moral hazard argument. The idea here is by holding up carbon capture as a promising technology that can fix the emissions of the fossil fuel industry, we end up delaying the work we need to do to shut down the fossil fuel emissions in the first place. Don't take my word for it. Take the word of the CEO of Occidental Petroleum. She argues that because of DAC and CCS, we don't ever need to stop oil. This is a direct quote. And that the technology gives them the license to continue to operate for another 60, 70, 80 years. That's the CEO of a big oil company who also, by the way, just got $1.2 billion of our tax money to build one of these things, and then just acquired one of the largest carbon capture companies in the world. They're saying the quiet part out loud. This is intended to keep them drilling oil, not to stop climate change. So here's what we're trading, folks. At best, we're trading a few seconds of CO2 removal each year to give an industry a PR fig leaf to allow them to delay and delay and delay what we actually need to do. So this is about a bad idea, as you can imagine, as far as climate change is concerned. And I don't understand why all the hype is kind of encouraging this. It doesn't make sense. Instead, what we really have to do, what the science demands we do, is just focus on cutting emissions. And yes, let's continue to invest in R&D. Maybe there are materials down the road, not what we're using now, though, that can absorb CO2 at scale using industrial methods. Maybe there's some new polymers, some new graphene, something else, a nanomaterial, I don't know, but it's not the acids and sorbents we're using today, that's for sure. And maybe we could focus more on nature-based paths where trees and soils do absorb carbon, but we're gonna have to figure out how to keep that carbon locked up. Do we turn it into bio-oils, biochar? Do we torrefy that and bury that material? Let nature capture the carbon and then we store it? There's all sorts of other ways we could do this that actually make sense and don't present this technological, economic boondoggle and the moral hazard, which ultimately puts more carbon in the atmosphere than it could ever possibly remove. So I'll stop here. Sorry for the technical glitches, but hope we can have a great conversation later. Thanks.
Could I please have a member of the AV staff help me access the PowerPoint now? Well, they're bringing that up, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Jane Patton is the campaign manager on the U.S. fossil fuel economy at the Center for International Environmental Law. Since 2016, Jane's work has focused on organizing and coordinating groups around the world and in her home state of Louisiana, and fights against petrochemical pollution and false solutions to the climate and plastics crises. And in case you're wondering why we're going from Jonathan's global analysis of carbon drawdown to a case study on Louisiana, I'm going to share just 3 facts about Louisiana to segue to Jane's presentation. First, Louisiana is the 4th highest emitter of carbon in the United States. It emits more than 240 million net metric tons of carbon a year. This is 0.5% of the entire global emissions and equivalent to a mid-sized European country. Second, compared to the rest of the United States, where about 30% of emissions come from industrial sources, in Louisiana, that number is 67%. So switching to EVs ain't gonna cut it in Louisiana. And finally, most importantly for today's conversation, the total industrial emissions in Louisiana, as of today, are currently set to increase by 2030, not decrease. And as we're going to hear, much of that industrial increase is being driven by CCS. Jane, over to you.
Thanks, Maya. And thanks everyone for having me here today. As Maya said, I'm with the Center for International Environmental Law. I'm a campaigns manager over there. Used to work on plastics and petrochemicals, and now I focus much more on the petrochemicals and carbon capture and storage side. I'm also a lifelong resident of Louisiana. I'm a 6th-generation Louisianian. My dad's family goes back multiple generations in Mississippi. So I find Louisiana, actually, by fact, Louisiana is a very sticky place, and I'm not just talking about the humidity. What I mean by that is that Louisiana has one of the largest percentages of people who grew up in Louisiana and lived there their whole lives, of all the states in the US. And if you had told me that at 18 when I went abroad to get my degree, I would have probably lost my mind. And now I have made my lifelong home in Louisiana. I grew up in Baton Rouge, and I live now in New Orleans, which are at opposite ends of the Cancer Alley, the industrial corridor that Chip mentioned earlier. I've lived my whole life in the shadow of this space, and I've witnessed the injustices that are manifest. Because people who look like me, that is white, privileged people, are not the people who are hurt first and worst by Cancer Alley and by the industrial corridor. And that is manifest in the entire history of Louisiana and Mississippi and the entire US. And it plays out today also. That industrial corridor that we call Cancer Alley, that is also an outdated framework. That industrial corridor actually now stretches all the way down from the southeast corner of Louisiana all the way across to the Texas-Mexico border. It is basically one long industrial corridor. This is a map of the existing injection wells of all kinds. Most of these are oil and gas wells. Some of them are also wastewater wells. This is the existing injection well map in Texas and Louisiana. All of these injection wells are also mapped onto industrial oil and gas, petrochemical, agrochemical development all across the Gulf Coast and Texas and Louisiana. You also see a concentration here in the Haynesville Shale and here in the Permian Basin, which are both natural gas reserves, methane reserves under Texas and Louisiana. This is just Texas and Louisiana. This is the existing footprint. When we talk about putting carbon capture and storage, implementing that to capture emissions, we are not talking about putting it on this existing infrastructure. We are talking about a new infrastructure. And what the existing infrastructure means for the people in Texas and Louisiana is it means sinkholes. In Bayou Corn, Louisiana, which is just one example, an old waste injection well managed actually by Occidental Petroleum, which is the oil and gas company that John mentioned in his presentation. Occidental Petroleum was managing a Class 5 waste injection well in Bayou Corn, Louisiana, and that well failed. And when it failed, it created a 24-acre sinkhole. As I mentioned, Louisiana is a very sticky place. People who grow up in Louisiana tend to stay in Louisiana. More than 300 people had to abandon their family homes and still have not been able to go home and will never be able to go home. They had to go to the Louisiana State Legislature years later and pass a law to require that the state of Louisiana buy them out at a rate high enough to actually be able to buy a new home. This is what our existing well management program looks like. It looks like sinkholes and failure and people being deprioritized. And with carbon capture and storage, we are actually talking about building out an entirely new industrial infrastructure. New pipelines, new emissions sources, new injection wells. This is from the Great Plains Institute that draws these maps and says, this is going to be a beautiful, wonderful thing. We're just going to move carbon around the country. But as Maya was laying out, there are 3 phases to this carbon capture and storage system. There's capture, there's transportation, and there's injection. The CCS build-out is actually about adding new development. It's new emission sources. It's not retrofitting onto existing emission sources. And that carbon capture technology is only capturing some of the carbon, if it captures any of it at all, and it doesn't capture any of the other emissions from these technologies. So when you talk about steam methane reforming, turning natural gas into hydrogen, that process also comes with other emissions. It emits benzene, it emits toluene, it emits xylene, among a list of other carcinogens. Now, you may not know what any of those chemicals are, but there are people who live in Cancer Alley, grandmas who should be making pie, who live in Cancer Alley, who know all of the medical effects of toluene, and they know how to say it. There are people in the Houston Ship Channel who have to communicate in Spanish with the people who live in the Houston Ship Channel, the effects of 1,3-butadiene, because it's being emitted by these new emission sources that are being justified and paid for at the public's expense with the cover of carbon capture and storage that doesn't even work. And when we're talking about carbon pipelines, about moving carbon around the country, these are not your mama's pipelines, y'all. These are 48-inch triple pipelines that will be moving highly pressurized, very cold, supercritical liquefied carbon around the country. That is a massive, the average natural gas pipeline is 8 or 12 inches. This is a 48-inch pipeline. They're talking about building 70,000 miles of new pipeline on top of what is already described, not by me, but by carbon capture and storage proponents, as a spaghetti bowl of pipelines in Louisiana and Texas. This is the build out that we are talking about when we talk about carbon capture and storage. And the people of Yazoo County, Mississippi, y'all may have heard of the incident that happened in Satartia. 3 years ago, a small town in Mississippi got a lot of rain. That happens. When they got a lot of rain, the existing CO2 pipeline managed by Denbury, a company recently acquired by Exxon, failed because the mud underneath the pipeline shifted and it cracked, and it released a plume of CO2 into the air. And that plume rushed out because when it's kept at very high pressure, that means like when you shake a soda can and then burst it open, which is full of CO2, it goes psh. And that's exactly what happened. CO2 is heavier than air, which means it's settled near the ground. And all of a sudden, dozens of people around this pipeline explosion suddenly couldn't breathe. They were foaming at the mouth. One woman called 911 saying, "I think my daughter's having a seizure. I don't know what's going on." And the 911 operators couldn't get to them because not only do people require oxygen to breathe, and when the area is flooded with CO2, you can't breathe. Guess what else requires oxygen? Internal combustion engines, which is what ambulances and fire engines use. So when you call 911 because you can't breathe because of a CO2 leak, the fire truck can't get to you, and they don't know why. The first responders were not prepared, and none of the first responders are prepared for the risk of CO2 transportation and injection that is coming around. Now, the first panel talked quite a lot about hydrogen hubs, and I want to talk about hydrogen hubs. This is a map of what we think are the hydrogen hubs that are coming to the US. We don't actually know because none of this information is being made public. S&P Global had to call each of these companies individually and say, "Hey, did you get invited to submit an application to the Department of Energy, a public agency?" Because the Department of Energy would not tell the journalists and the media who were covering this who submitted applications. We're supposed to get an announcement of who got funded by DOE. They've been saying that announcement's coming tomorrow for like 2 weeks. We still don't know when the hydrogen hubs are going to be announced. And these hubs, as you learned earlier, have names like Wish and Halo. Halo is the one in Northwest Louisiana. And I feel like they have names like that because they wish that these were not going to have any impacts on local communities, and that's just not true. In South Louisiana, regulators have actually told us that when they check these facilities for environmental justice concerns, if they pop on the EJ screen, which is the tool used by the EPA, they consider themselves legally prohibited from changing a siting decision based on environmental justice concerns. They literally have told us they cannot do that. This is a serious concern that communities have. And the vast majority of this build out for hydrogen is not green hydrogen. It is not hydrogen made from water using renewable energy. It is blue hydrogen, which means it is made out of methane. This is a publicly funded laundry machine to turn fossil fuels into hydrogen, into clean energy, at the expense of the people who live next door to these facilities. And the reason why we fight this, and I just want to say it in summary because John covered some of it already, specifically in Louisiana, we fight it because CCS is a proven failure. It does not work. It's never met its targets. It also increases risks and emissions because it's being used to justify new emitters and because CCS uses a huge amount of energy, and almost all of that energy is fossil fuel energy, which creates new risks for people. It also is being rushed into implementation by state agencies that are already ill-equipped to handle the industries they already have to oversee. And companies are using carbon capture and storage to farm subsidies, to take the public's money. And then we see when the application actually happens, they then charge that back to the public. The Kemper coal plant, which implemented carbon capture and storage, this was in Mississippi a few years ago, implemented carbon capture and storage under its previous label of clean coal, which we widely consider to have been a failed thing, and yet that's what carbon capture and storage is. The Kemper facility is still, years after it was mothballed and in fact destroyed, they demolished the carbon capture and storage infrastructure on top of that coal plant. They are still charging the local community for the costs of the loans they took out to put that carbon capture on that facility. This is an economic injustice in addition to it being a risky one. In Louisiana, we are not taking this lying down. We are fighting back and we are winning. Louisiana is a year behind where they thought they were going to be in getting permission to permit carbon injection wells in the state because of our organizing. We built a local coalition called the Louisiana Against False Solutions, or LAFS Coalition. I'm particularly proud of the acronym because it makes us joyful. And we get together and we talk about how to do this. And we've created a multiracial, multicultural, multi-age coalition that is fighting back. We are pressuring the state legislature. We are holding assemblies. We are educating the public. We just had a public meeting in Lafourche Parish, which I'm not going to make anybody spell that. But it's a rural part of Louisiana. And more than 75 people came to this meeting. And all of them left with information, more information than the company gave them in their own meeting last month. And we are getting everybody fired up about submitting comments to the federal government. And I only laugh because if you've never asked a grandma in rural America to submit a comment to the EPA, you haven't lived. And it's very fun. And we got over 10,000 comments submitted to the EPA in the last round. We forced a third round of comments, which was, thank you, because these wins don't come easy. And they're only possible and supported because of the investment and beliefs of people like Maya and the 2030 Fund believing in the fact that we have to say no to this stuff. Because at the end of the day, the people of Louisiana deserve better. Y'all deserve better. You deserve to be able to come together in rooms like this and believe in the solutions that you are discussing and the things that are being put forward. And carbon capture and storage is a myth. It does not work. And laundering fossil fuels into hydrogen using carbon capture and storage is an economic injustice, it's an environmental injustice, and we all deserve better. I said earlier, thank you. I said earlier that I grew up in Louisiana, that I've lived my whole life in Louisiana except when I was a full-time student. My husband's family goes back multiple generations in Louisiana. Y'all, we ain't going nowhere. And my home is dying. It's dying. And they want to turn it into unlivable Swiss cheese while they disinvest and disinvest and disinvest and try to force people out and not buy us out. I have 23 years left on my mortgage, and I genuinely don't think I'm going to be able to live in my house through that time, much less consider it an investment or something that I could pass on to children. Y'all, my home is dying. I'm here today because I'm an expert on carbon capture and storage and because I'm an organizer and a campaigner, and I'm also someone who's going to be forced out of my home because of these false solutions. I chose to put cypress trees here because I actually have the cypress tree tattooed on my arm. It is the state tree of Louisiana, and I get the symbols of Louisiana tattooed on my body because I know I will not be able to live among them as I get older. This is not conjecture and wish and belief. This is a very real future that we are facing unless we do something different. And I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Both to Jonathan and Jane for that. We're running over, but I'm going to do just a very quick 5 minutes of discussion, and I'm just to keep things efficient. I'm going to ask just a couple of questions to our panelists here, and I'm going to take the role of devil's advocate, right? Because if we want to find the solutions that have the best cost benefit for what we're trying to do, we really do have to ask questions of all sides every time. So my first question is, look, you guys pointed out a lot of challenges. This is a technology, right? But the truth is all world-changing technologies take time to reach technical feasibility and financial viability and commercial scale and get safer over time. I mean, at one point, solar panels were, quote, too expensive to be a real solution, right? So isn't everything you just described just necessary part of building the market and developing technologies? And why shouldn't we expect CCS to just get better over time and fulfill its promise just as solar panels have done? John, then Jane.
Yeah, well, we have to keep in mind, first of all, that most technologies fail. 99% of new technologies in a lab don't actually come out to market and work. That's why we keep inventing new things, and most of them don't work. A few of them do. This is one that doesn't work. And it's not new. We've thrown tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars of our tax dollars at this exact same technology for decades. Since there's been a Department of Energy, there have been subsidies for this kind of stuff. They just rebrand it every few years. It used to be called clean coal. That didn't work. Then they called it, and it didn't sell very well. They were even calling it that through the Obama years. Then CCS, which people didn't really, it sounded good. Hey, we'll capture the pollution instead of putting it in the atmosphere. But it didn't work, and it cost us billions and billions of our tax dollars and still failed. Just providing a PR device for oil companies. That's all it's ever been successful at doing, frankly. And now we have DAC, which is, let's make the problem at least 10,000 times harder by doing it outside. Okay, but this is not like magic technology, folks. Take a chemistry class. It's a fan, some solvent or sorbent, stuff that absorbs gases, and a big pipe after you liquefy it. The thermodynamics of this suck. They're really hard. And we can't debate the laws of physics. This is really almost impossible. A far better way to do it is let trees and soils do it and find a way to kind of bury organic carbon or keep forests alive for long periods of time. Nature is a hell of a lot better engineered than we are. So that's where we should be putting the monies into nature, to cutting emissions in the first place. And maybe, a few $1 million maybe should go to universities and independent think tanks or whatever, developing some actual breakthrough technologies. But this isn't it. We're using 19th century technology trying to solve a 21st century problem, and it's not working.
Thank you. Jane, question for you. So, you described a number of challenges and consequences in Louisiana, but we are here in Colorado. And, Colorado is different politically, demographically, economically, geologically. So what are the lessons that are directly applicable to those in this room and around the country from Louisiana? Can we extrapolate? How should we extrapolate? And beyond feeling bad for you, why should we care?
I mean, I think you should care because I want everyone to feel very bad for me. No. one of the things we find in Louisiana is that the vast majority of people in Louisiana have no flippant idea what carbon capture and storage is. They have no idea. 99.9% of the people in Louisiana are like, I've never heard of that. But when we then talk to them about it and explain to them the element, the capture, the transportation, the injection, we talk about pipelines, we talk about storage, we talk about all of those risks, they're like, oh, hell no. They're very like, they want to do what? And so I feel like that is a universal experience. The minute you sit down and explain to people the actual infrastructure they want to build much closer to people's homes than the existing CO2 management pipelines and injections in the country, people are very reasonably opposed to that. We see that in Iowa, we see it in Nebraska, we see it in Louisiana, we see it in Texas, we see it in New Jersey. There's a lot of invisible organizing and education that is happening across this country in rooms that you guys are not in. And there are people in those rooms from Colorado. There are people in those rooms from California who are doing that, as Ella Baker called it, spade work, of talking to people one-to-one, of educating people, of moving them. Those concerns are universal. I'm not just concerned about the geology of injecting carbon under Louisiana because Louisiana is, flat and below sea level and sinking into the Gulf of Mexico, although I am concerned for all of those reasons. But I am concerned because of the geologic forces that are true everywhere. I'm concerned because of the footprints of pipelines, no matter if they're on a flat bayou or if they're across the Rockies. I am concerned about them. And I know you don't actually run pipelines across the Rockies. I'm just using a metaphor. And I think that that's something that everyone should be concerned about. And at the end of the day, the disconnect between the people who are making the decisions and making the investments and the people who will live next to this infrastructure is a disconnect that is happening everywhere. And until we are reckoning with the possibility of a pipeline carrying a toxic asphyxiant in our backyards, my backyard, your backyard, until we are reckoning with the possibility of injecting a corrosive asphyxiant under the ground in our own backyards, we cannot justly and reasonably say that it should go in someone else's.
Thank you. Jonathan, yesterday I received the MIT Climate Portal newsletter, which is put out by the MIT Energy Institute. And its headline article was about CCS, specifically making the case that keeping injected CO2 underground was, quote, relatively simple. In fact, if you do a Google search, many universities have institutes, such as the MIT Energy Institute, which have published research and papers that more or less say CCS can work, is safe, and is needed. Now, I will also mention that when I look at the sponsors of these institutes, I see who is paying for the research, and it's primarily paid for by oil and gas companies. For example, the founding members of the MIT Energy Institute are ExxonMobil, Shell, and Eni, which is an Italian oil and gas company. So these are scientists like you at some of the most prestigious universities in the country and the world. Their research is being paid by Exxon and Shell and Chevron. What do you make of that?
Well, not surprised. But I'll comment just on the science, not who's paying for it. I'll let people make their own conclusions there. But I can assure you that our organization is not funded by fossil fuel companies or interest. We don't accept their funding and never have. But let's just table that discussion for the other side. It's like, okay, I'll debate conservation of mass and second law thermodynamics with anybody, even from MIT and Stanford. Doesn't matter. This doesn't work. It is sequestering at most a few seconds of our annual emissions. These projects are in the thousands of tons range. Compare $1,000 to $10 billion. That's the difference we're talking about. And in the real world, that is only generating maybe some PR for oil companies, which allows them to keep pumping the pollution into the atmosphere. They're not even considering these social trade-offs here. And hey, look over here, we've got a little tiny pilot project, so we don't have to cut emissions over here. That's just not even the purview of a chemical engineer looking at the well. If you only look at the well, yeah, it stores carbon a little tiny bit, mostly to pump other oil and gas out of the ground, by the way. But yeah, from a really narrow little technical point of view, it, quote, works. But it doesn't. It's too expensive. We're paying for it, not the oil companies. It's giving them a PR, fig leaf. And by the way, they didn't account for this, what energy was used to do it. And if it's fossil fuel, it's a waste of time. And if it was renewables, those renewables would have been better off used anywhere else. So we didn't have to burn coal and oil in the first place. So from a super narrow technical perspective, yeah, it, quote, works. You can lock up CO2 in rocks. But from any bigger definition of did it work from a societal point of view, absolutely not. And I don't know anybody who can contradict that with actual data. So, and I've been looking, I want these to work. I really do. It would be great if we had a machine that could just suck greenhouse gases out of the sky. That would be awesome. We could all go home. It doesn't work. We're going to have to do the actual hard work of cutting emissions and transitioning to a renewable energy economy that doesn't do this. That's it. That's the only answer. This is a distraction, and it's intentionally a distraction, and it's working pretty well.
John commented on the science. Would you like to comment on the other, and then we'll wrap up so we don't eat, so we all still have time to eat lunch.
Oh gosh, if I'm standing between people and lunch. We see the fossil fuel agenda around promoting carbon capture and storage and net zero and even most hydrogen in this country. We see that agenda manifest everywhere. You know, part of the reason why I got into this work and space from Louisiana is because the Net Zero America researchers from Princeton came down to Louisiana and gave a presentation to my state legislature's climate task force that was created by the Louisiana governor. When you dig deeper, just like the MIT Energy Institute, that Net Zero America study at Princeton was paid for by the oil and gas industry. And they are bringing it on the road. They are taking it to state legislatures. They are taking it to state regulators. And they are saying, this is good and this is what you need to do. And they're not disclosing that it's paid for by the oil and gas industry. But in Louisiana, the oil and gas industry doesn't just pay for the research. I don't know if any of y'all have ever attended Jazz Fest, New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival. Yes, brought to you by Shell. They are the main sponsor of Jazz Fest. If you've ever attended French Quarter Fest in New Orleans, which used to be more local and is now national and international, that one's sponsored by Chevron. Any baseball field you go to in rural Louisiana, not even that rural, is paid for by whatever industry is closest to the baseball field. These companies have not only funded the research that supports their agenda, they also buy social license from the local communities. They pay for things like that cost, pennies on the dollar of what they would be paying if they actually paid their local property taxes, which they don't. So the situation we fall into is that they pay $500 for a baseball field, and then they don't actually pay the property taxes they need to pay. And this is a serious concern that we're seeing across the board.
All right, well, we are over time, so we are stopping there. Thank you so much. I'm sure there are questions from the audience. I'm sorry we did not have time to get to those, but I encourage you to find Jane or myself. We'll be here all day. Thank you so much. Chip, back to you.
Thanks.